Before becoming a name surrounded by accounts of visions, Ellen White lived the narrow and tiring routine of a young family in the popular Protestantism of the American Northeast and Midwest in the 19th century. After her marriage to James White in 1846, domestic life was not organized around stability, but around constant change. The hospitality of others, small bills, and tireless work. When their first child, Henry, was born on August 26, 1847, the couple still depended on the help of friends and relatives for accommodation, and Ellen, at only 19 years old, hoped that motherhood would allow her to stay home more. Biographical records preserved in Adventist documentation show that this did not happen. A movement between the homes of supporters, meeting halls, bad roads, and scattered villages made the White home less of a fixed place and more of a temporary arrangement, made up of suitcases, papers, children, and accumulating commitments. In her autobiographical accounts, later published in Life Sketches, Ellen herself recalled years marked by poverty, illness, and constant displacement in an environment where cooking, washing, sewing, writing letters, and preparing material for printing were all part of the same day. Early Adventism offered no institutional comfort. It was a small movement with few resources, and this placed a much greater practical burden on the couple than their later public image often suggests. In practice, living behind the visions meant managing very ordinary tasks. Ellen wrote by hand amidst the noise of the house and the urgencies of the printed work, and would later explain that she first recorded what she understood she had received, and then together with James revised the text, removing repetitions and correcting grammatical errors before sending it to specific people or to the printing press. This description of her own process shows a routine that was less mystical than laborious: handwritten pages, remade copies, careful revision, and extensive correspondence. The recent article by Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventist information about her literary assistants confirms that Ellen did not dictate her texts. She wrote everything by hand, reread the material before publication, and, as her work grew, began to employ copyists and assistants who lived in her house, were fed by her, and worked under precise instructions not to alter her thinking. This detail helps to understand the concrete texture of her daily life. A desk occupied by manuscripts, rooms full of people, visitors coming and going, secretaries, circulating children growing up amidst the pressure of the mail and the printing press. The weight of her work did not rest in a silent study, but within a residence that was also an office, a guest house, an improvised infirmary, and a decision-making center. This bustling household was plagued by intimate losses that were difficult to conceal. The firstborn son experienced his parents' instability from birth, and the expectation of a more regular domestic life soon gave way to the awareness that travel would continue. Over the years, Ellen would have 4 children, but she wouldn't raise them all to adulthood. Henry, the eldest, died in 1863. John Herbert, born on September 20, 1860, lived only a few weeks. These facts, recorded in official family biographies, don't appear merely as marginal notes. They help to measure the human dimension of the public figure. The woman who wrote for churches and participated in decisions about publications, health, and religious discipline also had to endure pregnancy amidst changes, temporary separations caused by travel, and grief within a movement that was still barely structuring itself. Her later image as an authoritative voice of Adventism often obscures the emotional cost of having lived under constant expectation. Without the private protection that later religious leaders would have, there was also physical frailty. Adventist biographical sources record that Ellen strongly felt the limitations of her formal education, interrupted in childhood by a serious accident, and carried throughout her life a feeling of literary inadequacy. This did not deter her from her work. On the contrary, it increased her dependence on daily discipline. Writing required time and strength, something she did not always possess in abundance. Later in her mature Australian phase, she would record that she wrote every day about the life of Christ, and descriptions of her home in Sunnyside show the continuity of this work pattern: a simple diet, 2 meals a day, bread baked in an outdoor oven, an orchard, a vegetable garden, house full of people, and manuscripts being organized in a filing system. In 1896, there were 12 people living in Sunnyside, and visitors of various conditions passed through her living room. The picture is revealing because it brings the historical figure closer to the reality of everyday life. Ellen White did not live isolated from domestic conflicts. She lived surrounded by them, trying to maintain order, hospitality, and written production at the same time. In the period preceding this more stable phase in Australia, the pressure was even more intense. Battle Creek would become the Adventist center, but this did not mean rest. The shift from Review and Herald, move to Michigan, and the expansion of editorial responsibilities transformed James and Ellen into a constant point of reference for disputes, finances, and the direction of the movement. In August 1865, James White suffered a stroke after months of stressful meetings and internal conflicts, an episode documented in J. N. Andrews' biography. For Ellen, this meant more than marital concern. It meant dealing with her husband's convalescence. A continuaco do trabalho e as expectativas de uma comunidade que via no casal ixo coeso. As vissels nes contexto não eliminavam o esgotamento humano, conviviam com ele. A autoridade pública de Ellen crescia ao mesmo tempo em que sua vida privada era comprimida por doenças, lutos, escassez e responsabilidade editorial. Foi nesse ambiente de pequenas tarefas e grandes crises que sua figura histórica realmente tomou corpo, e a partir dessa tensão doméstica que os acontecimentos posteriores começam a ganhar peso diferente. À medida que o pequeno movimento adventista deixava de ser círculo disperso de crentes e se tornava uma rede mais organizada de publicações, reuniões e concílios, a vida doméstica de Ellen White se tornava ainda menos protegida da pressão externa. Os primeiros anos de seu casamento já haviam sido marcados pela pobreza concreta. Relato autobiográfico preservado Life Sketches James White descreveu como após o nascimento de Henry em 26 de agosto de 1847, o casal, a situado da Casa dos Howland, iniciou a vida doméstica com móveis emprestados e enfrentou período em que ele precisou trabalhar no transporte de pedras na ferrovia para não depender financeiramente de outros. That of a family protected by religious prestige, but of a couple trying to balance sustenance, writing, travel, and a young child in a very limited economic environment. Shortly afterward, the need to move among Adventist groups scattered across various states led Ellen to one of the most painful decisions of her private life. Recent biographical sources on Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventist documents from the period record that Henry was entrusted to the care of the Howland family for years because his parents were unable to provide him with stability while traveling. The very memory of this separation appears as persistent suffering, and this detail significantly alters his later public image. Behind the figure seen in meetings and printed pages was a mother living with the guilt and sadness of seeing her own son grow up partially away from home. Even when the children were around, the house didn't function as a quiet refuge. The growth of the publishing work transformed daily life into a continuous flow of manuscripts, letters, visitors, and deadlines. Ellen would later explain that she wrote by hand, read what was copied to check if everything was correct, and only then did the text go to press. Selected messages she stated that James, while he was alive, acted as an advisor and assistant in sending. The message is that they both traveled extensively and that she herself acutely felt her academic and grammatical limitations when preparing material for publication. In January 1873, she recorded that her husband was too weak to help her with the manuscripts and that she did not consider herself capable of preparing them alone for the press. Decades later, in 1902, she would still claim to revise everything that was copied before any publication. These records do not diminish her activity. On the contrary, they show the severe discipline required by a literary production carried out amidst fatigue, family life, and constant public scrutiny. At the same time, the material pressures of the movement reached the dining table. In Coorambong, Australia, at a later but revealing stage of habits that had already begun, the house called Sunnyside brought together 12 people in early 1896. There was an orchard, a vegetable garden, bread baked in an outdoor oven, a simple diet of 2 meals a day, and a hall always open to the sick friends, workers, and leaders. The same source records that her correspondence and manuscript collection were organized with the help of Sarah Peck in a permanent filing system, while she wrote books and oversaw the establishment of the Avondale School. Although this phase belongs to the 1890s, it helps to clearly visualize the lifestyle that had been consolidated early on. Ellen White's residence was also a place of work, lodging, sorting papers, administrative conversation, and domestic effort. There was no clear boundary between home and public mission. The daily routine consisted of simple meals, receiving people, proofreading texts, guiding assistants, and managing the most common details of survival. At the heart of it all, James White's health became a decisive factor. The accumulated tension in Battle Creek, the internal disputes, and the weight of leadership took a heavy toll. Recent academic studies and Adventist biographical records indicate that the stroke James suffered in August 1865 came after a long period of strain. For Ellen, this meant much more than simply dealing with her husband's illness. It meant absorbing some of the void left by his weakness, continuing to write, maintaining the confidence of a still fragile religious group, and reorganizing family life around a man who was once active and now needed prolonged recovery. Instead of distancing her from her tasks, the crisis seems to have concentrated them even more on her. The image of authority that was being established in the public sphere grew alongside restless nights, financial insecurity, separated or sick children, and a marriage subjected to continuous fatigue. Even the most intimate pain did not stop there. John Herbert, the youngest, was born in Battle Creek on September 20, 1860, and died as an infant at 2 months and 3 weeks old. A few years later, Henry also died, and the successive loss of children left deep marks on the family. Thus, when one observes Ellen White at the center of early Adventism, one sees not only the author or the character associated with visions, but a 19th-century woman trying to maintain some order within a home constantly, beset by illness, grief, displacement, and collective expectation. It was in this terrain of common tasks and human wear and tear that her public presence acquired density. And it is from this phase of domestic and emotional compression that the following years become even more revealing. After the death of James White on August 6, 1881, Ellen White's life entered a phase where domestic solitude and public responsibility became even more visibly intertwined. For decades, James had been a traveling companion, editorial advisor, crisis manager, and a constant presence in a routine marked by meetings, printing, changes of address, and health problems. When he died in Battle Creek, mourning did not lead to prolonged withdrawal. Adventist biographical sources record that Ellen remained obligated to continue writing, speaking at meetings, and overseeing the leadership of a movement that was already much larger than the small circle of the 1840s. In a brief biographical account preserved in works of the White estate, it is observed that James's death ended years of accumulated physical strain and opened a period for Ellen in which she decided to continue her work, without the figure who had so long served as practical and emotional support. This did not transform her into a distant figure. On the contrary, it makes her more human. Widowhood did not remove her usual tasks, it increased their weight. The house continued to demand order, the mail kept arriving, the manuscripts needed revision, and life around her did not slow down to accommodate her loss. From then on, the routine became more clearly dependent on a domestic structure of assistants, copyists, and family members. The article by Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists regarding her literary assistants, the account notes that, as her work grew, Ellen wrote manuscripts by hand, and others helped her with copying, organizing, and preparing the material for publication, always under her reading and approval. The same record highlights that, after her husband's death, faithful helpers began working constantly with her in preparing testimonies and articles. This detail says a lot about her daily life. Her residence was not just a private address, but a place where people came to work, eat, review paperwork, await guidance, and participate in a routine that mixed domestic life and editorial production. Instead of an isolated author, we see a widowed woman, aging. Ever wondered what it takes to write over 50 books and 5,000 articles by hand? Let's dive into the incredible life of Ellen White, a woman whose literary output is nothing short of astonishing. Imagine this. It's the 19th century, no computers, no spell check, just a pen, ink, and a mind overflowing with ideas. That was Ellen White's world. Born in 1827, Ellen's formal education was cut short by a severe childhood injury. But this didn't stop her. She became one of the most prolific female writers in history, a co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and a voice that reached millions around the globe. Her writings have been translated into over 160 languages, making her one of the most translated authors in the world. So, how did she do it? What was her daily routine like? And what kind of pressures did she face in a world that wasn't always ready to listen to a woman with such a powerful message? Ellen White's day often started before the sun came up. She believed that the early morning hours, when the world was quiet, were the best time for writing and connecting with her thoughts. She wasn't just a writer. She was a wife, a mother of 4 boys, a public speaker, and a community leader. Juggling all these roles required immense discipline. Her life wasn't about waiting for inspiration to strike. It was about creating a routine and sticking to it day in and day out. Think about the sheer physical effort. Writing thousands upon thousands of pages with a dipping pen is a monumental task. Her hands would cramp, her eyes would strain, but the words kept flowing. She would often write for hours on end, sometimes even while traveling on bumpy trains or in horse-drawn carriages. Her commitment was fueled by a deep sense of purpose. She felt she had a divine mission to share her insights on health, education, family, and faith. Her writing process wasn't a solitary one, though. She had a team of helpers or literary assistants who would help her with copying, researching, and preparing her manuscripts for the publisher. People like her son, Willie White, and Fanny Bolton played crucial roles. They would take her handwritten pages, often filled with edits and notes in the margins, and type them up, making them ready for publication. This collaboration was essential to managing the sheer volume of her work. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Being a prominent public figure, especially a woman in the 19th and early 20th centuries, came with intense pressure and criticism. She was constantly under scrutiny. Some questioned her authority, others criticized her teachings, and some even attacked her character. Imagine pouring your heart and soul into your work, only to have it picked apart and misunderstood. It took incredible resilience to continue. There were also personal challenges. She traveled extensively, which meant long periods away from her home and family. The life of an itinerant preacher and writer was demanding. She crossed the United States multiple times, spent nearly a decade in Europe, and another 9 years in Australia, establishing schools, hospitals, and publishing houses. This constant movement was physically and emotionally draining. And then there was the financial pressure. In the early days, her writing didn't bring in much money. The publishing work was a mission, not a business venture. She and her husband, James White, often invested their own limited funds to get their pamphlets and books printed. They lived simply, putting the mission before their own comfort. They believed so strongly in their message that they were willing to make personal sacrifices to get it out to the world. Let's talk about the content of her writings. Ellen White wrote on an incredibly broad range of subjects. Her book, The Ministry of Healing, offers practical advice on physical and mental well-being that was way ahead of its time. She advocated for a vegetarian diet, fresh air, sunlight, and the importance of trusting in a higher power for mental peace. In an era when medicine was still quite primitive, her emphasis on preventative care and natural remedies was revolutionary. Her writings on education were equally groundbreaking. She championed a holistic approach to learning, what she called the harmonious development of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual powers. She believed education wasn't just about cramming facts into a student's head. It was about building character, teaching practical skills, and preparing young people for a life of service. This philosophy led to the establishment of a worldwide network of schools and universities that still operate today. Perhaps her most famous work is The Great Controversy, a book that traces the history of the conflict between good and evil from its origins to its ultimate conclusion. It's a sweeping epic that has been a source of inspiration and debate for generations. Writing a book with such historical and theological depth required immense research and focus. She described the process as receiving visions, which she would then write down and expand upon with historical study. The pressure to be perfect was immense. Because her followers believed her writings were divinely inspired, every word was weighed and analyzed. Any perceived inconsistency or error was pounced upon by critics. This meant she and her team had to be meticulous in their fact-checking and editing. Can you imagine the weight of that responsibility? Knowing that millions of people are basing their life choices on your words, it's a burden that would crush most people. But Ellen White seemed to thrive under this pressure. Her conviction in her mission gave her the strength to persevere. She wasn't just writing books, she was building a movement. Her words were the foundation for a global community. She wasn't an academic theologian in a dusty library. She was a hands-on leader, deeply involved in the practical application of her ideas. Her home life, when she was actually home, was a hub of activity. Her house, which she called Elmshaven in California, was always full of people, family, staff, and visitors from all over the world seeking her counsel. She managed this busy household while maintaining her rigorous writing schedule. She was known for her hospitality and her practical, down-to-earth nature. She loved gardening and found joy in the simple things of life. This connection to nature and everyday life kept her grounded amidst all the pressures. Let's consider the legacy of her discipline. What can we learn from her today? In our age of constant distraction, Ellen White's life is a powerful testament to the power of focus and routine. She shows us that great things are not accomplished by sporadic bursts of effort, but by consistent, daily work. Her story is an inspiration for any creator, writer, or entrepreneur who feels overwhelmed. She also teaches us about resilience. She faced criticism, personal loss, and immense stress, but she never gave up. She held on to her vision and her purpose, and that carried her through the darkest times. She understood that opposition is often a part of pursuing a great mission. The sheer volume of her work is still studied and debated today. Scholars analyze her literary sources, her theological development, and her influence on the Adventist church and beyond. But beyond the academic debates, there's a human story of a woman who, against all odds, used her voice to change the world. A woman whose workday started before dawn and whose ink-stained fingers penned millions of words of hope, guidance, and challenge. So, the next time you pick up a book, think about the person behind the words. Think about the discipline, the sacrifices, and the pressures they faced. In the case of Ellen White, it was a life of extraordinary dedication. She wasn't just a writer. She was a force of nature, a woman of iron will and unwavering faith, whose legacy continues to ripple through time. Her life reminds us that with purpose and discipline, one person truly can make a world of difference. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story inspiring, please give this video a like and consider subscribing for more deep dives into the lives of incredible people. Let us know in the comments what part of Ellen White's story stood out to you the most. See you in the next video. The Battle Creek Crises, strong feelings arose against what Adventists called the spirit of prophecy, an expression used to designate her testimonies and writings. The summary of the period shows that the leadership turned to her for guidance, but also reveals resistance, distrust, and contestation. This is no minor detail. It shows that Ellen White ended her life not only writing books in relative rural tranquility, but also following a movement that debated, sometimes harshly, the extent to which her warnings should shape institutional decisions. In other words, the final phase did not erase the conflict between the private person and the public figure. On the contrary, it made this conflict more acute because her voice was already recorded on thousands of pages and circulated within a much larger religious body, with its own interests, ambitions, and tensions. Criticism regarding her writing process also weighed heavily on her. Some of these suspicions arose from the role of literary assistants and the reuse of previous materials. The subsequent debate about sources and literary borrowings was fueled precisely by this documentary reality. Ellen White wrote, revised, reused old manuscripts, guided assistants, and shaped books in successive stages. The important point, historically, is that this process did not disappear from the eyes of those who lived with her. It was part of her routine. Some accepted this as a working method typical of a very productive author. Others saw room for doubt, criticism, and resentment. The White estate acknowledges that discussions, about the use of sources and editorial preparation marked a historical reception, and the biographical material from her final period highlights the concentrated effort in producing her last books, with the awareness that time and strength were running out. Thus, the controversies surrounding her texts did not arise outside of her daily life. They grew from the very concrete mechanics of the work that occupied her days. This picture becomes even more human when one observes old age. In 1912, already in her 85th year, Ellen White declared that she did not feel able to undertake certain trips, and that her time and strength needed to be dedicated to her books. The formulation is revealing because it replaces any image of inexhaustible vigor with one that is much more real, a tired woman, aware of her physical limitations, carefully choosing what she could still finish. Old age did not diminish the expectations placed upon her. Her name remained linked to advice, manuscripts, decisions, and editorial projects. At the same time, her body no longer corresponded to the previous pace. In her final years in Elmshaven, her routine became even more dependent on the work of her children and assistants, especially William C. White and close collaborators to maintain the organization of the house and the literary work. The center of Ellen White's life, then, was not in extraordinary scenes, but in something more silent, an elderly woman seated among papers, memories, revisions, and visits, trying to organize what she would leave behind. When she died on July 16, 1915, she left behind not only a disputed and preserved religious legacy, but a human record of continuous work under pressure. The full house, the children marked by losses and responsibilities, the long-standing mourning for her husband, the illnesses. The critics, the assistants, the effort of revising each page, and the need to maintain some order in daily life form a less idealized and more historical portrait. To see Ellen White behind the visions is to see her living like so many women of the 19th century who juggled home, writing, illness, and public scrutiny simultaneously, with the difference that, in her case, every private decision reverberated within a religious movement in formation. And it is precisely this combination of common routine and historical weight that explains why her presence continued to influence Adventism far beyond her own lifetime, paving the way for the memory, the debate, and the interpretation that would come later. In short, Ellen White lived under constant pressure amidst writing, family losses, illnesses, travel, and public responsibility. Her daily life was far from idealized. It was marked by continuous work, domestic discipline, and very clear human limitations. Viewed closely, her story reveals less a distant figure and more a 19th century woman trying to sustain home, faith, and duty amidst the harsh demands of early Adventism.